thousands of centuries.
Guinan's statement implies that the Borg themselves are very old, but what she's technically stating is that the Borg components are very old. We can assume that the Borg might be a more recent combination of older, previously existing machine and organic life. A second, more data-driven way to conclude that the Borg have a relatively recent origin is to rely on their species designation numbers, which they use to label the different species they assimilate or contact. We know just from these numbers that they've assimilated only thousands of species, not tens or hundreds of thousands, as their unrelenting drive might suggest. In fact, the highest designation number we've seen mentioned is species 10026, which was encountered by the USS Voyager in the year 2375. Easily assuming that the Borg would label their inductees in numerical order, we can conclude that the Borg have assimilated at least 10,036 different species. If the Borg were much older, we would expect much higher species designation numbers, perhaps numbering in the hundreds of thousands or even millions. We'll return to these designation numbers in a moment. A Borg age of about 1,000 years also has a third, more precise line of evidence.
You're Borg.
How do you know that?
Don't you recognize my people? The Vaudois?
The collective's memory from 900 years ago is fragmented.
In this 24th century conversation, Gedrin expresses a familiarity with the Borg that suggests a relatively lengthy relationship with this species, yet suggests the Borg collective is not much older than 900 years. Allowing for the development of interstellar travel, we round out the age of the Borg interstellar civilization at about 1,000 years. This places the Vaudois contact with the Borg at around the late 1400s Earth time. How else can we infer this time period as the right one for the origin of the Borg?
In my century, they'd only assimilated a handful of systems. It looks like they've spread through the quadrant like a plague.
From the sound of it, the Borg were really just starting out when they began encountering the Vaudois. So it is a rough estimate, but 1,000 years prior to the 2370s, or during Earth's 14th century CE, seems to be about right for a Borg origin period. Now that we've established a relative birth date, what else do we know about these delicate early years of the Borg? Well, they were a minor power in the Delta Quadrant for a few centuries, contending with the Vaudois and the Tuareg and other local powers. The Tuareg, and an alliance of several species, took down the dominant Vaudois in the Earth year 1484, which suggests that the Borg were starting out in a hostile, politically dynamic neighborhood of the Delta Quadrant. The Borg's fragmentary memory from 900 years ago reinforces the violent nature of this time and space for the Borg.
When a drone is damaged beyond repair, it is discarded. But its memories continue to exist in the collective consciousness. To use a human term, the Borg are immortal.
Considering how Borg so-called immortality works, in order to cause fragmentary memory within the collective, you have to kill an awful lot of drones. So, this being the case, the Borg's early years appear to be quite traumatic. One would assume it was a period of slow expansion and perhaps more than a few setbacks. Interestingly, we can further infer a rate of early Borg expansion based on the species designation numbers we mentioned earlier. Note this conversation from the Voyager episode, The Omega Directive.
When did the Borg discover Omega?
229 years ago. It began with species 262. They were primitive, but their oral history referred to a powerful substance which could burn the sky. The Borg were intrigued, which led them to species 263.
So, we note in this conversation that species 262 and 263 were assimilated in the year 2145. If species 10026 represents the latest Borg inductee in the 2370s, then we can calculate that in the 229 years between 2145 and 2374, the Borg assimilated approximately 42 species per year, for a total of about 9,751 species. The Borg rate of expansion from the 14th century through to 2145 was about 2 to 3 species per year. So the Borg started out slowly, gained speed through the centuries, and exploded in the 22nd century. It is also in the 700-year time frame after the fall of the Vaudois in 1484 and before the Borg discovery of the Omega particle in 2145 that the Borg managed to gain access to transwarp conduits. This was a huge deal for the Borg. as it allowed them to appear on the doorstep of many civilizations that weren't necessarily adjacent to Borg space. Considering the drastic increase in assimilation rates, Borg acquisition of transwarp conduits may have occurred closer to the 2145 date. The next point that we see the Borg on our timeline is in the year 2063, as they travel back in time from the year 2373 to assimilate the Earth. They fail thanks to some heroic Starfleet personnel. Wreckage from this failed time travel assimilation plot lands in Earth's Arctic region, where humans discover it in 2153, 90 years later. Revived drones attempt to take advantage of the situation, but are again stopped by Starfleet personnel. Sometime around 2265, the Borg assimilate the Elorian homeworld. Elorian refugees like Guinan, Martis Mazur, and Dr. Tolian Soren scatter out into the surrounding galaxy, reaching Federation worlds like Earth around 2293. It is an injury from which the Elorian race may never recover. As a response to the Elorian assimilation, Starfleet must have begun a more formal, probably classified investigation into the Borg around 2293, and very likely took note of the Borg drones discovered on Earth back in 2153. In 2353, human exobiologists Aaron and Magnus Hansen began a years-long study of Borg behavior. They carried their young daughter, Annika, with them aboard the USS Raven, a small science vessel. A few years into the study, the Borg assimilated the entire family. Little Annika would go on to become 7 of 9.
I do not enjoy crowds.
But you were in the collective. Wasn't that like a big crowd?
In 2362, the USS Tombaz assimilated near the border with the Romulan Empire, indicating that the Borg were making incursions around the edges of Federation space. Other ships and outposts in this area of space are destroyed or assimilated through the year 2364. In 2365, the USS Enterprise D, courtesy of Q, encounters the Borg formally. Commander Shelby is brought aboard as a Borg expert in 2366 and 67 during the Next Generation's